Hi everyone, and welcome back. We are joined again by Ian Proud, a former British diplomat, to discuss the failed peace negotiations in Ukraine and the continuation of weapon shipments and sanctions. So it's good to have you back.
Good to see you again, Glenn.
You're actually the ideal person to speak with on this topic, as you were stationed at the British Embassy in Moscow between 2014 and 19, and you were the person responsible for signing off on the British sanctions on Russia. So you have some good insights on this sanctions policy and what they're intended to achieve, and again what they're actually achieving. But I thought we can start at where we stand at the negotiations, because we still seem to be very far apart. Some argue that the negotiations failed. Others point out they didn't really even begin. What is your position?
Well, the negotiations they lasted about 40 minutes, as far as I understand it, and there was some discussion on the exchange of prisoners of war and on bodies of the fallen, which was a continuation of what was discussed and agreed during the May talks, where there's some kind of good handovers of POWs and bodies that took place after that. But there's no real discussion of the substance, in terms of how to actually break the deadlock in the peace, in terms of talking about Russia's concerns, particularly around, NATO and the disposition of territories and so on. So it achieved practically nothing in terms of the real substance of, the kind of Russian concerns that have to be addressed before the war comes to an end. And the Ukrainian side will have been acutely aware that in any case, on the 2nd of September, Donald Trump's 50-day deadline will expire, after which Trump has promised to impose massive secondary sanctions on Russia, specifically 100% tariff on those countries that actually import Russian oil and gas and other products, notably China, but also India and other countries as well. So from the Ukrainian point of view, they didn't really need to do anything because come the 2nd of September, Russia will be sanctioned anyway. So why make a breakthrough in peace talks, which might derail sanctions?
Yeah, that's a strange dilemma of all these American threats, because every time they want to put pressure on Russia, they effectively create incentives for the Ukrainians not to move. That is, as you said, if they're going to have this crippling sanctions on Russia, why would you make any concessions on the Ukrainian or the European side? Um, but on the basics, so what is the format for the talks? Because it seems as if the Ukrainians and the Western backers still talk about an unconditional ceasefire, which means not addressing the political root causes of this conflict, while the Russians are saying we can't have a ceasefire before we have addressed the root causes. So, and the root cause then will be, I assume, restoring Ukrainian neutrality. So, well, what is there? Is there a meeting point there, or is it just, it's pointless at this point?
Well, the European side in particular has resisted in any efforts to actually address Russia's underlying concerns. This notion of an unconditional ceasefire is completely unrealistic because there's no incentive there for Russia to sue for peace, not least because the massive threat of sanctions is hanging above them, and which will become an inevitability, it seems, on the 2nd of September. And we've been here before, of course, after the Minsk II agreement in February 2015, when just in March, I think the month after that was agreed, the European Council decided to lock in sanctions against Russia, conditional on the full implementation of the Minsk II agreement. And of course, that required Ukrainian action. Therefore, that disincentivized Ukraine from taking action, particularly devolution in the Donbass, which made sanctions permanent. And we're in exactly the same situation again. There's no incentive on the Ukrainian side, and frankly, there are no incentives on the European side to kind of sue for peace if that leads to sanctions against Russia being removed. So, actually people need to take a step back when talking about an unconditional ceasefire, because actually when you look at the circumstance on the ground, on the battlefield, the pace of Russian advances has accelerated. There's this incursion into the center of Pokrovsk just over the past week. They've been making sort of large ground in other places along the front line. What does an unconditional ceasefire mean? Why would Russia do that when it is making advances and when it's only facing sanctions and it sees a West that has absolutely no intention of addressing its concerns, which is, as you say, the neutrality point?
It sounds when you speak that sanctions has become a goal of its own, but spending time in the British government and engaging with the other Europeans, what is the thought process now, you think? Because if we are losing the war in Ukraine, what is plan B? Is it to drag it out as long as possible? And I mean, if if we won't address the root causes, Russia will not give up on this war unless it has neutrality in Ukraine, and we're losing the war. What is plan B here?
Well, I'm not sure anybody's ever really articulated what a plan B looks like. Right back to the start of 2015 after the Minsk II agreement, people just invested in sanctions as a less costly option than actually direct military intervention in Ukraine by Western troops. And they've clung to that position ever since, despite everything that has happened, despite the over 1 million people killed or injured in the war itself. There is no real plan B. I think Western leaders know that should Zelensky sue for peace in a much weaker position than he was in March 2022, when the first Istanbul round of talks, were taking place, and that will be seen as a catastrophic failure on their part, because actually Ukraine will be in an even worse position than it was then, and they will have been talking all this time about ultimate victory against Russia, and in fact, Ukraine has lost out, and actually European citizens have been impoverished in the process. So the alternative to just carrying on regardless with the failed policies they've been adopting for the past 10 years is catastrophic failure, and they're therefore kicking the can down the road because they don't want to face the political consequences of that in their countries.
So strategy is kicking the can down the road while all the young men are dying. But
Yeah.
there's some other things that has perplexed me. That is, whenever the Zelensky speaks, he keeps arguing that he must meet with Putin. This is the only reasonable format. What is this obsession with meeting Putin? I mean, if you haven't ironed out the main issues, what is this supposed to achieve? State leaders usually do not do the negotiations.
Well, I mean, Zelensky is a showman, and he wants his kind of moment of theatre to kind of showboat in front of his Western paymasters and, show that he's somehow humiliating Putin, who for a while has said he doesn't recognize Zelensky as a legitimate leader of Ukraine, because elections haven't taken place since May of 2024. So I think for Zelensky, he sees it as his moment to kind of be seen as this global statesman, meeting Putin and in some way humiliating Putin. But it's not actually sure how he could do that, because Ukraine is losing the war. Zelensky is, as we've seen, losing popularity in Ukraine itself. And from the Russian side, they will want for the leaders to meet, for there to have been some groundwork done on the topics for discussion. Right now, if we haven't got past actually the discussion of prisoner handovers and the handovers of bodies, then actually Putin won't meet until there's a proper agenda on the table, and that will include neutrality, and that will include issues around how the disposition of territories is recognized, without some preparatory work having been done to sort of get closer to a point where they might be able to find an agreement. Then why would the Russian side want to meet? Clearly leaders meet when 95% of an agreement has been reached, and they need to hammer out the final most tricky issues together. We're nowhere close to the point where we're at that. We're not even talking about Ukrainian neutrality, at all. What would they discuss? Would they meet? And Zelensky said, well, we're never going to give up NATO. And Putin would say, well, okay. I mean, what would they discuss
Yeah.
if that work hasn't been carried out?
Well, some of this theatrics, as you called it, seems to work, though, because there has been a bit of a narrative shift in the United States. Back a few months ago, when they had that big spat in the Oval Office, we saw that the Zelensky was blamed for refusing to speak with the Russians, but now with this theater, like he wants to meet Putin. I want an end to the peace, and an end to the peace is now translated into unconditional ceasefire, which would, I guess, remove all pressure on Ukraine and Europeans to make any concessions to begin with. But it seems to work, because now in the political media establishment seem to be able to push the narrative that, well, look, Zelensky, he wants peace. He's calling for a ceasefire, while Putin does not want peace because he wants to address the political causes of the war. So what is... how do you think Trump is buying this, or is he playing a game as well? Because at the beginning of his presidency, he did seem to recognize, and he mentioned at least on 2 occasions, that NATO expansion was the cause of the war. So how are we back at unconditional ceasefire, which would be almost a capitulation for Russia?
Well, the unconditional ceasefire is a line very much driven by the European side more than, I think, than by the American side. I think actually the Americans are probably acutely aware of some of the simmering tensions within Ukraine itself, and have played this role somewhere in the middle, between Russia and between Europe and Ukraine, as Europe and Ukraine are essentially sort of one unit for the purpose of this discussion. I think the Americans will know about the challenges, that Zelensky is facing to his domestic position, right now, but unable to kind of cut through the intransigence on the European side. The Americans are just kind of playing a bit of a waiting game here. That's how I see it. I mean, I do worry that Trump has been bullied into, supporting this secondary sanctions approach, which I think will only actually backfire on the US itself, as Trump's trade tariffs earlier in this year also did, and he had to back down from them. I mean, Trump doesn't really seem to have a clear strategy right now, but I don't think he is aligned with the completely unrealistic unconditional ceasefire line that the Europeans and Zelensky are taking. But I think again, he finds himself powerless to kind of cut through and make a deal out, as he did, quite frankly, in 2017 after he came to power the first time round in his first term.
Yeah, so Trump came with his threat. Putin had to accept a ceasefire within 50 days, which is September 2nd, or...
Yeah.
So, yeah, otherwise he would have this sanctions on Russia, which would include 100% secondary sanctions. In other words, China, India, Brazil, anyone who trades then primarily energy with Russia would get hammered. But I guess I have 2 questions. How likely do you see that these countries will be allow themselves to cut themselves off Russia if they haven't done it for the past 3 years? And also, do you think Trump would actually impose these sanctions, or is this just a bluster? I guess another exercise of kicking the can down the road.
I think this actually puts Trump in a very, very difficult position, because he set himself an ultimatum here, quite frankly. And if he looks back just since, the spring of this year, his effort to really bludgeon China with massive trade tariffs didn't actually really work. The Americans were forced to back down. Increasing numbers of American economists worry about the kind of threat to the US domestic economy just from that first, round of trade tariffs earlier this year. So the idea then that he can go back and suddenly impose 100% tariffs on, in addition to what they already have on Chinese goods, I think is a bit of a fantasy. But I think Trump has allowed himself to be backed into a corner on this, and it puts him in a very, very difficult position. But I mean, I think what we've seen is actually events, quite separate to tariffs, quite separate to what's happening on the front line, taking a different turn anyway through these protests we've seen in Ukraine over the past week, through Zelensky's doubling down on political oppositionists, through the increasing strain that he's coming under. So I think actually some of the pressures now are coming back onto Zelensky, ironically. Last week, before the kind of protests in Kiev, I thought actually that we'd end up in a situation where the Russians would keep fighting into 2026 because they're, no sanctions, no calls for an unconditional ceasefire would actually motivate them to change tack at a time when they're winning. Right now, I think actually events in Ukraine could potentially bring the war to an end sooner than that.
Well, people usually look towards these two pathways, either a defeat on the battlefield or political collapse in Kiev. Both seems to be possible prospects, but looking at the possibility of a political collapse, many people obviously see Zelensky as a key obstruction to peace, given that he kind of dug himself into this very maximalist position. Um, but what's happening now around Zelensky? Because he made this massive when we're going after these anti-corruption institutions, effectively what America said would, what America set up to prevent the Ukraine from stealing the money. And now it appears that his image has been permanently tarnished in the West. That is, we never saw headlines like this before. Do you think this will be taken advantage of to have him replaced by someone like Zelensky?
I think it's been a massive wake-up call in the West, and it's been long in the coming. I mean, every Ukrainian president since the gaining of independence in August 1991 has had a cloud of corruption around them, right? And Zelensky has been no different. I mean, even really since 2019, allegations of corruption against his inner circle have been swirling. The European Court of Auditors produced a really damning report actually in 2021 on the state of what they call grand corruption in Ukraine. The Guardian newspaper in 2023 produced a damning report about Zelensky's inner circle. But I think one of the problems is that actually the mainstream media generally, and Western politicians in particular, have kind of ignored that as Kremlin talking points, much like they've ignored stories about the bussification of young Ukrainian men forced to go to the front line and beaten up in the streets and loaded into minibuses. Any criticism of Zelensky has been kind of put to one side, or this is all too inconvenient, and now something that's happened which actually has been impossible for them to ignore. And so people like von der Leyen have had to come out, German politicians, the German sort of foreign minister, Western, as you say, mainstream media outlets. I mean, The Spectator and Matthews actually said that Zelensky should resign, which is actually a remarkable thing for a British mainstream media outlet to be saying that. This has been a huge wake-up call, because actually, having been protecting Zelensky for so long, European politicians and journalists can no longer ignore this. And of course, what they see and what they fear is that their citizens who've been force-fed propaganda that Zelensky's this big knight in shining armor on a white horse is actually just as corrupt and flawed as anybody that came before him. And that poses a massive political challenge for these European politicians, in their own countries. In Germany with the rise of the AfD, in France with National Rally, in the UK, with Reform, and in Central Europe with these parties, particularly Hungary, that have been saying for a while that actually, why are we supporting this corrupt regime, in Ukraine that's making us poorer and pulling us all closer towards war? That question is now looming large in the minds of lots of ordinary European people who've been made poor by this war. And I think that's the huge challenge which may ultimately sort of unseat, the power base that's kind of locked in war for so long.
I get the impression this is one of the key flaws of this war, though, because it becomes so narrative-driven that the European elites, both political and in the media, they fail to see the reality as it is. Because I also noticed whenever some facts are presented, such as the massive losses the Ukrainians are taking, I mean, this is quite important if you want to have some strategic thinking where we're going from here. But when you say this, it's seen as, well, what narrative might this serve? So then the concern is, well, this will reduce public support for the war if there are high Ukrainian casualties. So this is a Russian talking point. We can't make this point. If you argue that the sanctions aren't working, well, now you're reducing trust in sanctions. This is also a Russian talking point. So we kind of divorced ourselves completely from the real world. And I think a lot of people have bet their entire political legitimacy on yes, remaining committed to these narratives. But the question for me was always what happens when these narratives are imploding, and it does seem this is part of what's happening now. I mean, after all of these headlines, isn't the door open for other criticisms of Zelensky? Suddenly, you expect newspapers now to report on political prisoners, the protest against, the drafts, the conscriptions.
Well, I think there has been a change of tone. Whether that leads to some radical shift, I'm not sure necessarily that it will. Whenever you read any of these critical reports of Zelensky, they're always heavily caveated. If you read them, well, we know Russia's bad and it's all Putin's fault, and there's lots of caveating in these articles. I don't see that there's been a wholesale kind of shift. There has been no reporting of Russification, as far as I'm aware of, in Western mainstream media. I see no likelihood of that changing. As you say, there's been no reporting, honest reporting of actual Ukrainian casualties in the war, because that, as you say, is a Kremlin talking point, and people carry on saying that sanctions are the only way to win. So, I mean, I don't see there being a radical shift, but I think increasingly politicians and journalists are becoming more skeptical, and actually their voters will be asking more questions and demanding the truth more than has been the case, frankly, for the past 10 years. And that can only be an encouraging sign.
Yeah, that's a good point. I've actually seen those within a few articles that yes, this might be more authoritarian. However, he's a wartime president, so this is Putin's fault. So it's yeah. But at the same time, you mentioned there's also possibility of the front lines unraveling, and this is definitely, as you said, Pokrovsk is probably the best example. And there's many other examples where the Russians are coming to well-fortified areas with the dragon teeth, the heavy trenches, but there's no one there. And they kind of just run straight through it. And the faster the Russians can move forward, the more of this ability to maneuver allows them to circumvent hard defended areas. It allows them to encircle a large amount of troops to capture or kill. So it seems to have this snowball effect that things are going from bad to worse a lot quicker. And then, of course, morale is dropping. You can see the kind of the chips falling. But how do you see this developing forward on the front line? Do you think the weapons that America wants to send can stabilize the front? Because Trump is now sending weapons. He argues he's only selling them. That doesn't seem to be entirely true. But irrespective of this, what kind of weapons can the West send, and what will the extent of the, I guess, efficiency or the purpose will be able to change anything?
Well, the Americans have been, and the Europeans have been sending weapons since the start of the war, and since, before the war, and it hasn't really changed the situation on the ground. I think if Pokrovsk falls at some point in the next month or two, that will have a massive psychological impact on the Ukrainian side, in the war. And I think that could be another game changer that piles further pressure, on Zelensky. I mean, talking about quantums of weapons when billions and billions of dollars worth of weapons have been just expended for no obvious gain on the Ukrainian side. It doesn't really seem to be, the question seems to be, well, at what point does, some sort of strategic loss on the battlefield so change that the mindset in Ukraine that on the back of this Zelensky's increasing authoritarianism, people start to demand a change before the whole of the Donbass, is lost over the coming year. And I think that psychological blow could actually, be very, very significant on the back of what's happened in Ukraine over the past week. I think Zelensky is going to find the ground less and less firm under his feet politically in Ukraine, in the coming months. And what's happening in Pokrovsk, the accelerated pace of Russian advances, which you can see every day on the Institute for the Study of War sort of live map, is going to start to take its toll. And as I said, Western citizens are going to say, well, why are we continuing to send weapons when they're losing quite badly, can we not just sue for peace? Why can't we have peace? What's wrong with having peace? They're losing. Sanctions aren't working. Surely it must be time to bring this to an end. I mean, this is a question more people will ask as they're fed propaganda that, well, we'll win in the end and there has to be an unconditional ceasefire, which are completely deluded.
Yeah, that takes me kind of to my last question, which is the whole effort to keep this thing going by weakening Russia further. The Europeans seems committed to continuing this sanctions. So we recently had this 18th round of anti-Russian sanctions. Well, it seems strange to ask if it's going to make any more difference than the former 17. But where do they go from here? Do they have anything else of significance to sanction, or will the sanctions just become riskier by going after Russian ships, which could then result in actual military clash? Where do you think the Europeans, including then the British, will go from here? Because it does appear, correct me if I'm wrong, that even some of the more hardcore in the anti-Russian camp, be it Starmer, Macron, that the rhetoric has toned down a bit lately. We don't hear that much about British fighter jets in the air above Ukraine or French troops stationed in the Ukraine. Are some people walking this back, or how are you reading the situation?
I'm not sure they're walking it back rather than simply toning it down. I think the truth is they don't really know what to do. Yesterday in the media, our defense secretary is saying that British troops would fight over Taiwan when we couldn't even send 10,000 troops to Ukraine. So I think, quite frankly, the notion that they have a clear plan for this, they're staying that down the barrel of defeat, and they're figuring out how to package that to their voters who've had to suffer cuts in public services, or at least the threat of cuts in public services, while we've spent billions to Ukraine to no benefit. They're worried increasingly now about the domestic political consequences of this war, I suspect, more than about the war itself. And I think that is a thing that's going to tip the balance, because they're waking up to the fact that actually this policy towards Ukraine has been a disaster, and that they're losing out and will continue to lose out in the polls. And if they had any political sense, they would press to end the war right now and have a proper dialogue with Russia. But I see no desire in Brussels, in London, to do that. I think they're drifting, waiting to see what happens next, kicking the can down the road.
Sorry, I'll have to add one more question there. Do you see any commonality behind this? Because this idea, British, I saw this, well, Britain and Australia would fight China, which seems very, very strange. Some rhetoric which should be taken very serious in the mid-19th century, but not so much now on the doorstep of China with this new powerful China. Is this just Europe failing to find its place in a multipolar world, or because there are, as you say, there are pathways to peace here. There's possibilities. It does seem that the national interest as well would be to tone down some of this, and especially now with this more energy-intensive economies, with the introduction of AI, we could really use a partnership with countries like Russia, but their national interests are rarely addressed these days. How do you see any overarching explanation what is happening to Europe these days? Because it appears all our policies just become an exercise in more self-harm.
Well, foreign policy begins and ends with domestic policy and with national interests. And as I said many, many times, that's about territorial integrity, that's about the security of your people, and that's about economic prosperity. And I think what's happened in Europe over the past 10 years, really, since the Ukraine crisis started, is that they've lost focus on what their kind of core strategic interests are. The European project emerged out of the Second World War, where through opening up economic, social, and cultural collaboration, we allowed there to be greater sort of openness, movement between sort of citizens of the different nations of Europe in such a way that it reduced tensions and reduced the possibility of going back to sort of further wars on the European continent. And that was a very, very successful formula. I personally don't believe that, the Americans underwrote European peace. I think it happened in an organic way by people just being more open and trading and engaging, with each other. But unfortunately, both the European Union and the UK have shifted towards actually we need to focus on having a foreign policy agenda here, and one of those is containing, Russia, and there's no really clear and persuasive national interest or a core strategic interest argument, to do that, because Russia didn't really pose a threat to mainland Europe prior to the Ukraine crisis starting in late 2013, but actually this antagonistic policy is become increasingly kind of self-fulfilling and self-supporting in Europe, and it's actually eroding the core strategic interests of Europe, which are the safety of citizens, the economic prosperity of the bloc, and that sort of thing. So people have lost all detachment with what strategic goal they're trying to achieve in this war, and actually they need to get back to the basics. How can we have an economic, social, and cultural community that also allows us to engage with wider Eurasian partners, and Ukraine, but also, with Russia and other kind of countries countries too, to the benefit of all of our citizens. That's going to be a far better way to secure their, safety in the future, their economic prosperity, and that sort of thing. We just need to get back to the basics of that economic, social, and cultural formula, I think, and ditch the Lisbon Treaty stuff, the European Union having its own foreign policy chief, and that sort of baggage. There needs to be a fundamental rethink of the institutions of Europe, or risk the European Union project falling apart.
Yeah, there's something changed with the EU, I think, after the Cold War, because after World War II, it appeared that within the European community, there was this idea of seeking security with other members, part of the club, instead of against them. So the
Yes.
French would seek security with Germany, not against them. And I thought often as political realists, we maybe underestimate the value of this by looking excessively perhaps towards institutions such as NATO and of course the US pacification. But nonetheless, this was kind of in the 90s, my hope that would be extended to the Russians as well. The principle of indivisible security would have security with them, not against them. And
Yes.
but you see the rhetoric shifting quite dramatically in the 90s. What security meant? It was suddenly security against non-members of the club, not with. And yeah,
Yes.
exactly what we're seeing now.
And of course, after the Soviet Union collapsed, it was security with the former bits of the Soviet Union that didn't include Russia.
Yeah.
Hence the Eastern Partnership Program, which led to the Vilnius summit in, the back end of 2013 and the Maidan protests that happened, after that. I think that's a real problem here, that we've kind of, lost sight of what it is we're actually trying to achieve.
Yeah, that's a interesting rhetoric. Well, already from the 90s, what the Russians were saying, they were saying the exact same thing. If you try to take our neighbors into the European club, but not us, you create dividing lines. This will revive the logic of the Cold War, and we're going to have conflict. And the worst of all countries will be the large and intimately close
Yes.
country of Ukraine. So this was the whole premise, and it's kind of we got to run this theory. What happens if you only try to bring in the Ukrainians, not Russia? Well, then you draw new dividing lines. You recreate the logic of the Cold War. You instigate military conflict, and yeah, here we are.
And the other thing is, of course, that people underestimate the kind of complexity of the dialogue within the European Union itself before it made this Lisbon Treaty kind of inspired shift towards greater politicization, militarization, if you like. I mean, the French and the British historically have a kind of very complex and often difficult relationship. You see that right now through the kind of migrant crisis and the boats, France and Germany, the UK and Germany. But I mean that, the European Union allowed us all to occupy the same tent and actually kind of talk about things of common interest, common economic interest, common social and cultural interests, which actually had a really moderating effect on some of those kind of historical and tensions between our nations. When you take that away, when the UK leaves, and when France possibly in the next 5 to 10 years, also leaves, then the prospect for peace in Europe itself is actually a very concerning one, I think.
Yeah. So yeah, Ian, thank you so much for your time. It's I'm hoping next time we'll have more positive side. No, it just it does appear that we're entering the final stages. If I'm not wrong, it's we can't go on like this much longer. The front lines, we're running out of Ukrainians and we're running out of weapons. So this proxy war will, I guess, come to an end sooner rather than later.
Let's hope that it does.
It could go into 2026. I don't know. I would have preferred to see a political settlement. I think every side, including the Russians, would have benefited greatly from this, as opposed to this ugly peace, which it appears we're going to get now through Russian victory, which will then just dictate the terms. So
yeah, there we go. It could have been very, very different had we ended it in March 2022.
I agree. So yeah, thanks again, and sorry for all the final questions.
That's okay. No, always great to talk, Glenn.
Thanks.